Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. My name is Pablo Hoyos, and I'm going to talk about the custom material layering system that we created at Rocksteady for Suicide Squad, Kill the Justice League. I'm going to talk about its inception, its design, and its implementation, what it was like to change a pipeline that was established in the character team from traditional texturing to material layering. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about the system itself. There's going to be a fair amount of time travel in this talk, back and forth. First, let's make sure that that we're on the same page as to who this talk is and isn't for. This talk is for people who are curious about different material layering approaches. I believe that the system that we ended up with is quite different from most material layering systems. And also people interested in the challenges of adopting new pipelines. We did a lot of learning about that. Spoilers, it wasn't love at first sight, but it worked out. This talk is not for people who are looking for an in-depth technical analysis of our material layering system or expecting hardcore under-the-hood wizardry tips. I'm just a character artist, more technical than most perhaps, but not technical to a level that I can give you these things. So, assuming everybody still wants to stay, let's have an overview of the talk. I'm going to start talking about the origins of the system, what motivated the change in the texturing pipeline. The character, I'm going to have a brief overview of the character customization options that we have. Then I'm going to start talking about how the system actually works, what happened when we deployed it to a team. I'm going to finish with some key takeaways of what worked great and what didn't work so great. And finally, if there is time, there'll be some questions. There'll be time for questions, hopefully. So let me take you back in time to somewhere towards the middle or end of pre-production of Suicide Squad, where my lead, Andy Matthews, approached me and said, hey, how would you like to get involved in creating a material layering system for the team? And my perhaps too honest answer at the time was, material what? I had no experience of material layering at the time. I had to get a quick explanation of what that was. But thankfully, I wasn't going to be alone. I have to give huge kudos. Well, I have to give most of the responsibility, really, to that guy over there, Lee Devonald. He is a technical artist, senior character technical artist, to be precise. His main focus was the character team. He's been at Rocksteady for almost 6 years, and he wanted me to clarify that he's not Samoa Joe in that picture, just in case there's any questions. Sadly, he cannot be here today. A couple of things to say about him as well that are important. He was a character artist for 10 years before transitioning to a technical artist, and that will be relevant. And also, he was able to do some character work in Suicide Squad. He made Toyman's little cute robot and a couple of outfits, a couple of variants. For myself, I am an advanced character artist. I've been at Rocksteady for over 17 years now. And just in case there's any question, I'm also not Samoa Joe. My experience in the company will be relevant to the talk. And also, I guess, as I mentioned, I'm quite technical for most artists, which will also be important. So what was the brief that we were given? There was an initial goal. First and foremost, this system was meant to support customization. It was the key reason for us to transition from traditional to material layering. And we wanted to be able to produce hundreds of outfit variants quickly and easily. There were some artistic requirements, of course. We had to make sure that we could hit the quality that we were after. And at Rocksteady, I think we tried to aim for a high quality bar and have quite little characters. So whatever system we ended up with had to give us this quality bar. And also allow us to react to the type of feedback that the character team usually gets. And that's where my experience at Rocksteady comes in, because I am very familiar with the type of feedback we get. Also, this system would have to empower artists to still be creative. As artists, we like to go into details, play with the wear and tear, hand place details where we want them. And this system had to enable us to continue doing that and continue to be creative. Happy artists do better work, so that was an important consideration. It had to be equal to traditional or better in terms of the creative experience, the production rate, and also, again, the quality bar. And finally, there were a number of performance considerations. When we started working on this, there was still a possibility that we might release on the previous generation of consoles, which we didn't in the end, thankfully, and this would have limited a lot what we could do, so we had to be very, very conscious. And also because nobody really, not me, not Lee, nobody in the character team had experience with material layering, there were many unknowns that we had to face. So we also knew what we did not want. We did not want a paint by number system. But what I mean by that is a system where you define your areas on an outfit and you drag leather here, blue cloth here, red cloth there, blue wool there, and you're done. This makes a lot of sense from a production speed standpoint, and also in terms of consistency, because you can keep everything very controlled, and those materials will be PBR solid and all that. But I believe I speak for most artists when I say that it's every artist's worst nightmare. There's very little room for creativity. And I think as well that it limits, it hinders quality as well, because you don't have room to really dive into the details and put the artist touch in there, in my opinion. Also, we did not want a system created without artist input. I believe that such a system is a recipe for disaster. You could have the most beautiful and solid system that the tech artists are high-fiving each other for and they love. But then if you hand it to the team and they cannot deliver the results that they're expected to deliver, then you don't really have a system. It's not going to work. So Lee and I started to work on this. And the first question was, is there anything that we can use to get a head start? Unreal had, at that time, we were using Unreal 4. And there was a material layering feature, but it was in beta, so it was not advised for production, so that was a risk that we had to consider. We ended up using it. It didn't give us everything that we needed, but it was a head start. We used a bunch of it. And then also we wanted to use Painter, Substance Painter, for our texturing. And thankfully, we were able to extend Substance Painter with the functionality that we needed in order to continue using it, even though what we were doing was very different from traditional texturing. So it wasn't one-to-one, the Painter implementation, but it's close enough that we can put these results. So now we're going to travel forwards in time to the finished system, so I can show you the kind of customization options that we ended up with. So there's two levels of variation. We have, on one side, the mesh variation. So each character has its own, his or her own, or its own base body, on top of which we build a series of outfits. We use Marvel's Designer and ZBrush, everything pretty standard up to this point. Most outfits have 2 mesh variants. Some have 3, and a handful only have 1. But where the variation really comes alive is when it comes to materials. So we have the concept of color variants, which really goes beyond color. You can have effects and all sorts of things. And these are just a handful of them for one mesh variant. We ended up with hundreds, almost 1,000 color variants. So I think we tick that box of supporting customization. Some of them are more complex than others, but and some of them take more time to produce than others, but we were able to create a bunch of variants. So let's now look at how the system works from the artist side. Again, not going to be able to go on the technical side, unfortunately. But so anybody here, who here who here knows what material layering is? Okay, quite a few hands, that's good. For those who don't, basically the basics of material layering is you have a bunch of layers, each with its own material. you define a set of masks that you apply to those layers to tell the system where each of those materials is supposed to be applied. And then finally, you generally have some per layer controls to define things like color or surface detail, that kind of thing. In our case, we have, on one side, we have the 3 common maps that all outfits use. Very few outfits have more maps than this, which are the ID map, which carries the layer masks. We also have the variation map, which carries information for the layers such as color, roughness, and surface detail coverage. And finally, we have the normal map, and we pack the ambient occlusion into it as well on the blue channel. Then, on another side, we have the layer stack. This is where we define what material each layer has. We hook each layer to the mask that it's supposed to use, which we can blend in funky ways. And we also control things like color, surface detail. We can add fake anisotropic highlights and a few other things depending on the layer. I'm going to go into some detail now about those maps. So this is the ID map, which, as I mentioned, carries the masks for each material. Most masks are binary. A material is either cloth or it isn't. It's either leather or it isn't, or metal. One of the few layers that have a soft mask is the dirt, because it's applied like more or less based on how you want it. It's because of the kind of coloring that we do, which I'll explain later. It's a delicate, soft masking is a delicate thing, but I'll explain briefly how we did that. Most cases, we have a limit of 4 layers per material, which sounds quite limited, but our system allowed us to produce the result with just 4 layers in most cases. In some cases, we needed to go higher, so we would pack 2 copies of the ID map into one, compressing them horizontally. Basically, you can imagine this, just compressed. We lose some horizontal resolution, but it gives us 3 more masks. So I forgot to mention, on the left, we have mask for the black channel, red, green, and blue. And on the right, just red, green, and blue. We could go up to 13, but I don't believe we have a single asset that went past 7. So another important map is the variation map. This carries the color on the red channel, which looks grayscale, and I'll explain what happens afterwards in a bit. The green channel, which carries roughness, and it's pretty standard roughness. And the blue channel carries the surface detail coverage. This one looks pretty binary, but it doesn't have to be. We are able to have soft masking for the surface detail for areas where we want it to fade, like worn out surfaces and whatnot. So color can surprise some people. How do we go from grayscale to color? Let's dive into it. So on each layer, we apply a color gradient, which is what we combine that grayscale mask map with through a technique called gradient mapping. Anybody here familiar with gradient mapping? Okay, handful of hands. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to explain how it works. Basically, if you imagine the grayscale map here, if you look at the histogram, basically the values from black to white from that map, if we overlay, not in the Photoshop sense, but if we put a gradient, a color gradient on top, each of these values corresponds to a color above it. So if we look at the dark side of the values of the texture, they will correspond with that, which you cannot really see, but imagine some sort of desaturated brown over there on the left. The mid-gray areas are a form of green. Can you see the screen? More or less. And on the right, we have a faint light yellow. If we have any values that are pure white of 1, they will be that color. So this is powerful in that if we change the gradient, we change the results immediately. So this gives us very quick, simple variation easily. So we can produce a different color, like this kind of simple variation, we can have a new variant in like 3 minutes for these trousers, for example. You just need to create a new gradient, create a new material instance, apply it, and you're done. Here are some more examples of the same trousers with different gradients applied and how those change. Again, this is the simplest form of variation. We have more complex one which takes longer, but it's very, very quick. Now, another key element of the system is the surface detail map. So surface detail map, the coverage again comes from the blue channel of the variation map, and we apply it to the layer. Each layer has controls for which map to use, which scale we want to apply it at. Also, how much of the surface detail, how it affects the color underneath, the roughness underneath, and how strong the normal component we want it to be. The way we pack our surface detail maps, we have normal X and Y on the red and green channel. Normal Z gets added in the shader. On the blue channel, we have the color contribution. The way this works is the light values of that channel lighten the color underneath, no matter what the color is, and the dark values darken it. And on the alpha channel, we have roughness, which works in a similar way in that the light values make things rougher underneath and the darker ones smoother. So this allows us to add a lot of fidelity and sharpness to our materials. Here are some examples of different surface detail maps applied to the same surface. Now I'm going to talk about another key element, one of the most important components of the system, color swatches. Color swatches are color assets that we use in gradients. So each of those little boxes on top of the gradient is a gradient stop. And typically, each of those should have a color swatch applied to them. In this case, all of the ones in the middle, which are the green ones, have that one applied. The cool thing is we can take each of those gradient stops and add variation on them. So we can have a hue, saturation, and lightness variation, which gets maintained. So if we get feedback to change that color, we can change the swatch, and all the variation that we defined is carried on with that change. So for example, if we had some feedback to make these trousers brown, all we have to do would be to change that swatch to brown, and there you go. Like super, super quick. So this is like a super important, super useful thing, which became a cornerstone of the system. Very powerful. I always say I always tell the same story when I talk about the ability to tweak color. Sorry, this gives us the ability to tweak colors live in engine, which is super powerful. I always say the same story about one time where Albert Feliu, our characters and weapons director, was on a call with, I believe it was DC, and they had some feedback about a brand color that a character had, which it wasn't quite the color that they wanted. So Albert was able to, on that call, find the color swatch, tweak, play around with it, until they found the color that they wanted. And that whole thing was solved in a matter of minutes, where on a traditional system, Albert will have to take a note of that feedback, come to us, give us the feedback. We will have to find time in our schedule whenever to implement it, send it back to him, send it back to Warner. Maybe they liked it, maybe they didn't. We could go on our cycle, and this could take days or even weeks. And this was solved in 5 minutes. So super, super powerful stuff. Okay, so I mentioned before that we use Painter we wanted to keep using Painter for this. So I'm going to talk a bit about the tooling that we needed. So we wanted a system that was as close as possible to Unreal, that we could preview the results, the final results, as close as possible to that. Again, it wasn't one-to-one, but it was close enough that let's say 95% close enough. So it was pretty good. But I mentioned that we used color in that weird grayscale way, right? We were actually working on a variation channel here, not the diffuse channel, not the roughness channel. So it looks something like this. if you look at the variation map, and obviously nobody can work like that. It's almost like sculpting directly on your normal map. Not good. So we needed a number of filters and custom layers in order to work here. The first thing we did was to implement, to create a new layer that was kind of like the big important layer for this, which took the variation information from below, took the red channel of that and converted it to color using gradient mapping. The green channel made the roughness, and then we had a way to visualize surface detail in Painter as well. So we also needed texture debugging tools. So again, because nobody could work in that weird gray, blue and purple way, and it wasn't always obvious what was happening when you looked at the diffuse map that we were previewing with. Sometimes you need to isolate a channel. So this will allow us to isolate, for example, in this case, the color channel. We also have things like PBR, value checkers, and that kind of thing. We also required a bunch of export presets, not just for the normal default export preset that would take the variation and the ID map and all that, but also, for example, our skin on the game was mostly traditional, but King Shark has these tattoos that glow, and those are made on a layer. So we needed a separate export preset for skin that use material layering, for example. And also we authored our surface details and a few other secondary assets in here. So we needed a way to export those as well. We also needed to make some changes to Unreal, specifically to the gradients side of things, as well as obviously the way the layers worked. On the gradients, we added a swatch list and a form of management of those. So if you click, in this case, the middle one is selected, and you cannot see it very well, but like that highlights the gradient stops that are using that swatch in red. So, and we can also replace that swatch with a different one if we need to, and keep the colors and all that. So I'm going to talk now about some of the layer types that we were able to use in the system. The three typical ones that like 90% of the assets use are cloth, dielectric, which is for anything from plastic, leather, rubber, and metal. So each of these has a different shading model and different functionalities that we can access. For example, like velvet on the cloth we can add and things like that. We also have dirt. Now, dirt was, I guess, surprising and challenging in a way. Surprising because we came from the Arkham games, which were super gritty and dirty. And here we obviously felt that dirt was going to be super important because of that. But it turns out that the direction changed a bit and things got cleaner. So we didn't use it as extensively as I thought we might. But also, if you remember what I was talking about before, the gradient mapping, how the grayscale values map with a gradient above, soft masking can really throw up those values. As you're like, if you have a 50% gray on this mask, it's going to get a blend between the value below and the value of this layer, and it's going to change, give you lots of artifacts. If I have time at the end, I may show you a slide of that in action. But basically, the way we got around it was that dirt has no color information. It's just one single color. It doesn't affect, no values to mess things up. We had a bunch of special layers. These are just 4 of them. First, we have the Toon shader, which actually is not a layer, it's a shader, but it's cool, so I wanted to include it. Then we have dynamic fire that we can place on different parts of the outfit. And also, I don't know if you can see, but like the metal elements are glowing hot. And we have like different kind of dynamic emissive functionalities. The third one is a holographic layer. And this is a very cool one. It's a type of drag and drop layer where we just put it on top of all the other layers in the stack. And it does a bunch of things automatically. So first, it adds those horizontal lines. It tints everything blue underneath. And it reads all the metallic values and changes them into a glowing color. In this case, yellow. So that was super cool because, like, again, I mentioned before, I don't like paint by numbers. This is as close as paint by numbers as it gets, but because we have textured everything before, and this gives you cool results very quickly, it's all good. And finally, on this one, I wanted to highlight the iridescent layer, which we have on the solder section. It's a bit like an oily, pearlescent type of effect. So something that Lee and I had to do regularly was to review the approved concepts as they came out, to look for any new layers that we needed to support the team with, or any new effects. This is the concept for the one that you just saw with the iridescent layer. And this one, we also realized that we needed those floating decals and the emissive ones. And sometimes we would see a concept that we would already have a layer for, but it will give us an idea to make it better in a way. So for example, this one or a similar one gave us the idea to add fluctuation to emissive. So it would kind of like glow up and down and be more dynamic, which we didn't have at the beginning. Oh, sorry, this was a video I had to show you the results. I knew I was getting too confident walking away from the slide assistance. Right, so we're gonna go back in time now. Lee and I have finished working on the system. It was ready to be deployed. So we're happily marching towards the team saying, hey, we finished, it's ready to start. And we didn't find exactly what we thought we were gonna find. We found these kind of faces like, what is this? This is weird, I don't like it. There was an amount of resistance, which to be honest is understandable. Change can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, and especially we're talking about taking a bunch of highly experienced artists who have been texturing one way for the entire careers and say, hey, we're going to change that now. We're going to give you a different way that instead of texturing color, you're going to texture in values. So you can imagine that they weren't super happy about that. Also, we had, as I mentioned before, like neither of us had experience material layering. So we were working based on our best guesses and estimations of what we needed. Turns out that some of the things that we thought were going to be super important were not. And some of the things that we thought were like a small thing were actually quite important. And I think it's fair to say that mistakes were made. And one of those mistakes was that we had based a core part of the system on an assumption that was incorrect. So we had to hit the brakes on production, because at that time people were already texturing. We had to stop all the texturing, go back to the drawing board, change that part of the system, go back to the team, and as a result, we had to do a bunch of rework to adapt the old assets to the new system. What I showed you is the new system, not the old one. Also, we only found the best practices through production. As I mentioned, like some of the things that we thought were going to be the dog's bollocks were kind of quickly ignored. And also, we didn't realize, if you look at the initial assets, they're a mess. It was super important that all the gradients should have color swatches applied to them so we could modify them quickly. Very few color gradients of the early variants have color swatches applied to them. But thanks to this joint effort between character art and tech art, we were able to maneuver quick enough, and I think in the end, the system was a success because of it. Tech art brought structure, and character art brought the flexibility a system needed. There was a bunch, after we deployed to a team, there was more of a back and forth, I think, and that improved everything. It wasn't just that Lee would give us a layer and we would go like, oh, that's cool, but can we do this or can we change that? But also sometimes we would ask Lee for a layer and he would go like, oh yeah, I did this, but also I added this other thing that I think you guys are gonna enjoy. So yeah, it was like, this joint effort between the teams was one of my favorite parts of the entire thing. Once we had overcome those initial hurdles, we carried on with the system and we started to grow it by adding new layers, such as clear code, even sequins for Joker, those Green Lantern layers, which are super cool, very dynamic. We also increased the surface detail library. We improved the documentation and onboarding. Credit here to Andy Matthews, our lead at the time, who was very adamant on documentation. And as the person who did most of the documentation, it was a pain at the time, but super important. Our first version of the documentation was quite dry, loads of pages with images and some videos, but it wasn't great. After that change that I mentioned, I had to redo the documentation or update it. But I was quite tired and lazy at that time, so I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna record some videos and just put them there instead of all these pages. And it turns out the lazy approach worked best, better than the old approach, and the onboarding after that was a lot faster. We also continued to support Painter, mostly with quality of life improvements, and to add features to the Unreal side. For example, the ability to access parameters in the layers themselves, which wasn't initially possible. One of the reasons for this was Kingstar's glowing tattoos again, which are linked to gameplay. So we needed to control it during the game. So I'm wrapping up now with some final thoughts. One of the things I did in preparation for this talk is I went to a team and I asked them if it was worth it. Wouldn't it be funny if I turned to you and said, no, actually, they said no. No, thankfully, they said yes, but they had a series of negative points as well, things that could have been better. So some of those things were, as I mentioned, the initial documentation was quite dry and a bit of a drag. Some artistic and performance limitations. Having generally speaking, a limit of 4 layers meant that we had to be a bit more careful with how we use those layers, and it was a bit limiting in a way. But also, I didn't cover it. I might show you again later, but like gradients are tricky. If you pack too many colors into them and you jump from one side to the other, you start getting lines in the middle with all the little colors that you have. So you have to be very careful with how you plan your gradients. And this can happen in a gradient itself or also between different layers. So we had to think a lot more than we had to think before with traditional texturing. The efficiency, it's hard to say whether this system was faster than traditional or not. In some ways, it definitely was. Like the feedback loops for those simple cases was, I don't know, 1,000 times faster. But the initial setup time was considerable. So you could spend a couple hours just before you started texturing, just making basic gradients in Unreal, sending them to Painter, applying them, changing them back and forth, and all that stuff. Development started late, again, like mid to late pre-production, and we had pressure to pass it to the team, finish it, and get producing stuff. This meant that we couldn't iterate as much as we would have liked to. And again, we couldn't find those big issues before deploying it to the team. And tooling support availability in general was good, was quite good, but we had mostly just Lee helping us. And he's just one guy, and he also had other teams to help and other responsibilities. So there were times when we needed a new layer or a new thing for Painter, and he just wasn't able to help us. We had to find workarounds and whatnot, or just wait. On the plus side, the things that went well, again, I think the collaboration between tech art and character art was fantastic. A lot of good things came out of it. Both teams got a better understanding of each other's, the things that were important for the other team and how we could help each other. The power of in-editor iteration, again, was fantastic. The high quality surface definition and variety that the surface detail maps allowed us, that was really good. The artist creativity was mostly unhindered. Yes, we had to think in different ways, and debugging textures became a thing that we didn't have to think about before. But we could still dive into details, apply the wear and tear how we wanted, add color variation, etc. Reduced texture footprint was something that we sort of were aware of at the start, but then we realized how much better it was. So as I showed you, 90% of our outfits have 3 maps for each material ID. In traditional, we will have the diffuse map. We will have 2 maps packing roughness, cloth masks, metal masks, opacity, emissive, and I don't know what else. And then we will have, at the very least, a series of masks for the surface detail application. So that's 4 maps versus 3, and that's the basic of it. Doesn't sound like a lot, but also the way our system works meant that we could take generally the ID map and shrink it down without noticeable impact on the final quality. In some cases, we could go down to from 2K to 1K, 512, or even 256 in some very few handpicked cases. But like even going down to 1K or 512, that was a huge improvement that we couldn't have done traditionally because of how that works. And finally, the characters got a lot of praise, which I guess is what we care most about. Not the praise itself, but like the fact that we did a good job, I guess. So I'm going to leave you now on the final slide with some key takeaways. If you're going to take on a similar effort of changing a pipeline at your studio, my advice personally will be to make it a joint effort between the people developing the system and the people who will need to deliver results with the system. Super, super important. And also, if you can, even though it might be simpler to get just like a few people working on it, not the whole team, but involve the rest of the team as well as soon as you can, because they will contribute ideas and steer you in the right direction, as I just said. Measure twice, deploy once. Don't do like we did and deploy it early, and then you realize that you have to change something and you have to stop production and all that. The sooner you can start with this, the better. Make sure you test as much as you can. Make sure you have good documentation. Super, super important. It will get any new artist up to speed faster. It will mean that they don't have to ask as many questions, so everybody can get on with their job. So yeah, it's a pain in the bum to make documentation, but it's a useful pain in the bum. Try to identify and streamline slow processes as early as you can. As I mentioned, the initial setup took a long time, and it would have saved a long time down the line if we had streamlined that early. And finally, maintain as much tooling support as you can. Try to ensure that you have somebody dedicated to the system with enough of a priority that they can respond to the needs as they arise. So that was my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Also, I was told to remind you to fill in the feedback survey, but I haven't seen anybody else remind people of that. So I don't know if it was a joke and I put it there for no reason. If there's a survey, fill it, please. If anybody has any questions, we can take them now, or if you've seen me outside, I'm happy to talk as well. Something like
for some of your more complex characters, were you splitting up your meshes into multiple material sections and then applying different stacks of layers to them, or were you just using just one mega layer for every character?
No, we will have different material instances, generally 2 or 3, although it changes from character to character depending on complexity. One difference is that we had to be a bit cleverer with how we packed how we separated those material IDs. We tried to pack the same material types together as much as possible to reduce, to make sure that we could hit 4 layers. So for example, we had characters where we would put all the leathers in one sheet. Even if it was just the lower part of the body, it would also have the upper leathers, for example. So then the upper had one free layer, that kind of thing.
And this was built for a system where the character's outfit is just one outfit, right? It's not split up into separate sections.
Yes. So we didn't. Our customization are like one-off outfits. Some of those, like for example, the trousers that I showed you are used on multiple customization options. But yeah, we didn't have a pick and mix type of system. Thank you.
Thanks. With the packing of normals, color, and was it roughness into the same texture map, you're kind of constrained that you have to use the same sampler settings for sampling into that texture, where sometimes you might want different settings between normal and the other information. Was that at all problematic, or it just worked?
No, we didn't feel the need for that. We had different controls for them in the layer. So we could have cases where the normal might be set to 1 and the diffuse and roughness 0.5 or 0, whatever. Is that what you're asking?
I mean, things like anisotropy and MIP mapping, that sort of thing.
Again, if Lee was here, he would be able to answer that question in more detail. It wasn't, as an artist, it was not something that became a problem. Like our anisotropic controls were separate from that. So yeah, it was fine. Sorry, I cannot give you a more technical answer. Hey, man.
If you were to go back in time, would you have done this for Arkham Knight?
This full disclosure, that's Cameron Small, artist in Arkham Knight at Rocksteady. Probably not, because the main power of this kind of system is for customization and for variation. So things like NPC populations, for example, fantastic. And you could go with a pay-by-number system for NPCs because nobody cares as much. But in Arkham Knight, we wouldn't have benefited as much for any of these things, except for like surface deal, which we also had. But yeah, I think this system would have been more of a hindrance for that project, even though we also had different DLCs and stuff like that, customization, but it wasn't to this extent.
Yeah. Cheers.
Thank you, man. I think we are at time. If anybody else has any more questions, wants to talk, just grab me outside if you see me. Thank you very much.